Okay, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. Really, really looking forward to today's conversation. We have Dr. Tom Ward and Dr. Gavin Kerr, and we're going to talk, I'm sure a bunch of different things, but, the joke is a Thomist and a Scotist walk onto a podcast, and then we'll see what happens, right? So gentlemen, thank you so much for taking the time to be here. It's really great to have you both.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I guess both of you guys are probably cool if we skip the introduction thing, because Gavin's been on the podcast a million times. Dr. Ward, you were on just the other week, so if people haven't seen that, please go check it out. I kind of want to just dive right into the good stuff because, and the audience is going to hold us accountable. Dr. Ward has to leave at 4:30. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. So if we don't get to the good stuff before then we're out of luck. So let's dive right in. I know you guys were recently at a conference together, and you were kind of throwing some ideas off of each other. And I wanted to kind of just, kick the ball in your guys' court and maybe let you pick up on some of those ideas. And then a little bit later, I do want to maybe nudge us in a couple particular directions. I do want to talk about individuation and divine ideas and stuff like that. But let's start with you, Gavin. What were you guys talking about before, and loop everyone else into that conversation? I think that could be fun. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no problem. So, we were talking about a number of things, including facial hair. But yeah, we've got 3 great facial hairs on the show this evening. But one of the things that it always interested me in Scotus was Richard Cross dealt with it in his book Scotus on God, and it prompted me to go back and read Scotus on the issue, and it was on essentially ordered series. And so, as you know, I've done a bit of work on essentially ordered series, and it's kind of what got me into the proofs of God and Aquinas, and it was developing a metaphysics of essentially ordered series. And one of the fascinating things that I found out in Scotus, especially in his treatise on first principle, is that he sets out conditions for essentially ordered series and for why they must necessarily terminate in a primary. And looking at those, it struck me that whenever I read some Thomists, one Thomist in particular, on essentially ordered series, or what he called hierarchical series, that he was depicting these kinds of series in a more Scotistic fashion. Although he says, he's a self-professed Thomist. We're talking about Fieser here. He was depicting these in what it seemed to be a more Scotistic fashion, as opposed to the Thomist fashion. And so on the Thomist account of per se ordered series, the members of the series don't possess essentially the causality of the series. So unless there is some cause for the causality of the series, the causality in the series is left unexplained. That's my understanding of the Thomist view. What I think Scotus, is particularly original with when it comes to per se ordered series, and I'm sure Tom can, draw this out further, is that he introduces a simultaneity condition, that the causes within the series must act simultaneously for the success of the series, such that, if there isn't some sort of, primary cause, everything else in the series just collapses and you don't have any causality within the series. So maybe Tom might want to, sort of flesh out Scotus's position in that matter a wee bit more, and we could, pick it apart and have a wee think about it.
Yeah. So from what's said, I'm not sure what's supposed to be different about the at least the Phasarian Thomist account and the Scotist account, as I understand it. I mean, tell me, just before I get going on this, though, tell me the simultaneity criterion. Do you not recognize that in Thomas?
No, I don't think so. I've never seen Thomas himself affirm it, and given the examples that he uses for per se ordered series, it doesn't seem to me that they're essential. That the simultaneity criterion is essential to the examples. All that's needed is that the causality in the series is, it's derived or participated causality. So unless you have a cause for the causality, you just don't have, the series in question.
I mean, talk through how you read the hand is holding the stick and the stick is moving the.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems like simultaneity is a good way to capture how the causality of say, the stick is working in that situation.
Yeah, so on my understanding, what's happening there is you have the agent moving his hand to move the stick, to move the stone. So what's happening is that the agent is imparting motion to the hand
Yeah.
and to the stick and ultimately to the stone, all of which would be immobile were it not for something to cause their mobility.
Yeah.
So that need not be simultaneous. That can stretch out over a temporal period.
I see. So it's accidental to the example that, strictly speaking, the stick is only moving while the hand is moving it, and the ball is only moving while the stick is moving it. And so we do have simultaneity, but that would just be accidental to. I mean, not accidental in the technical sense. It would be incidental to the example. As I see.
Yeah. So it just coincides, but it's not essential.
Can you do you have a go-to example of a non-simultaneous essentially ordered causal situation?
Well, I think the best example is creation in general. So the creation can be without a beginning. So things can come and go, but yet all things depend on God as primary cause for existence.
And so there you'd think because the creation considered actively is atemporal, it wouldn't be appropriate to describe it as simultaneous with the creation. Is that the thought?
I would go down that lines. Yeah, I mean, working it out. I would work it out that way. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think Scotist is very clear that he thinks simultaneity is a condition. Of course, he recognizes creation as the first causality, so to speak. God's the first thing in the order of efficiency, or the first thing able to cause an effect. God himself need not do it, of course, but if he does it, then the first efficient causality exerted, so to speak, is God's. And then everything follows from that. But he does agree with Avicenna, and by extension Aquinas, in at least the possibility of an eternal creation, or a creation at least without a beginning. That God has always been efficient causing something. So he wouldn't think that sort of situation would negate his simultaneity criterion. And so I'm puzzling over this because I'm sort of set in that. I'm having trouble lodging myself out of it. But
if I can interject here just real quick, because Tom, I know I sent you a draft of a thing that I submitted with a co-author, asking whether we should think of essentially ordered causation as grounding, right? And maybe this would be a way to help clarify it or get sort of what we're after here, because it seems like really what kind of marks grounding relation these days, at least in the contemporary landscape, are notions of simultaneity, or at least deep synchronic dependency, right? Take a cat. It seems like the cat, in order to exist, is dependent upon kind of deeper structures, organization of cells, which themselves depend upon organizations of amino acids and proteins and molecules and stuff. And in the sense that, like, if you deleted the lower conditions, you would automatically delete what's sort of above it. And I mean, I think that's certainly plausible. I think I think that that grounding should be considered a form of essentially ordered causation. But what I'm not sure is if all essentially ordered causation is grounding. And maybe that's what Gavin's getting at, if that makes sense. So I just want to throw that out there, right?
I think something here to remember as well is that when Scotus sets out the criteria for essentially ordered causal series, he sets out three different criteria, and the simultaneity is only the third criteria, but I think maybe it all rests on the first criterion that he sets out, and this is that in per se ordered series, what's secondary in the series, so what isn't the primary in the series, depends on the primary in the act of causation. So in the act of the primary causes causation, the secondary depends on the primary, and that's the first characteristic that Scotus gives of per se ordered series. But the way Aquinas characterizes the series is that the secondary members of the series, they don't depend on the primary in the act of causation. They depend on it for the causality of the series. So there's a distinct causality imparted to the secondary in the series for which they are dependent, but they're not dependent on the act of causation itself. And so if you go with Scotus on that characterization that the secondary depend on the first in the very act of causation, then there is going to have to be simultaneity, because as there is that act of causation, there has to be the dependency of the second on it. Whereas if you have the primary imparting some sort of causality to the secondary, then there need not be simultaneity.
They can sort of stow it away for a while and bring it out when they need it.
Yeah. And so to bring it back to Fieser, his example of the hierarchical series, he has the cup on the table, and the table or whatever, you get the image. It seems much more Scotist there. It seems to hit all the Scotist criteria for per se ordered series rather than the Thomist.
With the exception that it's not clear that those would be dependencies due to essence, and that's when Scotus comes in the section that you were just referring to, chapter 3 of De Primo and section 28. He's done a bit of work already to say what he means by essential order as such. Before we get to essentially ordered causes or other items that might be essentially ordered. So I think we need to read these three criteria in light of essential order as such, and it's at its most generic, it would be something like priority and posteriority due to essence. And that obviously requires lots of unpacking, but so where we have essentially ordered causal series, we have causalities that are essentially ordered, and so it turns out that one of the ways in which there are these three ways in which essentially ordered series differ from accidentally ordered series, but in addition, so to speak, these are items that are essentially ordered. And then for that, what can we say about that? Well, to be posterior to something due to essence means that by its very nature, it can only be what it is or do what it does, insofar as it's related to that to which it is prior. It's really like, part of the DNA of the essence, part of the structure of the essence, that it has this reference to the thing that is prior to it. So then, if we look at an example like the table upholding the cup, and I don't know, the facts about the gravitational pull of planets creating the conditions for the cup to actually be on the table, and so located at that very place in space. Those, I wouldn't recognize any of those sorts of relations as essentially ordered causes or causalities, because by divine power, if for no other reason, by divine power, God could make that cup occupy that very place, even if the table weren't there. If some magicians can cause things to levitate, of course God can. So yeah, I wouldn't recognize those as Scotistic. But then that raises for me a deeper issue with Scotus's account, which is that it's not clear to me whether we can know for any creaturely essence, whether it's essentially dependent on anything besides God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, so that's good. So draw that out. Why is that the case?
Part of it has to do with what I take to be a fairly strong doctrine of omnipotence.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Scotus is he distinguishes being able to do anything doable. That's logically from being able to do anything immediately. That's doable, and expresses some hesitation about the latter. So he does balk. He doesn't think that God could. He doesn't think he can demonstrate that God could do immediately whatever is doable. Nevertheless, when he's actually in the, despite the fact that when he talks about omnipotence as such, he expresses this hesitation about just how strong of a view it is. When he's sort of in the wild doing philosophy and theology, whether it's metaphysics or moral theology, he seems to rely on a fairly strong doctrine of omnipotence. And so the thought would be anything that comes about, which we take to come about through secondary causes. What would stop God from causing it immediately? If God could cause it immediately, then it looks like the thing that God could cause immediately does not depend in its essence on whatever secondary causes might in fact bring it about. Because it turns out it would turn out it's not built into the essence of that thing, that it's essentially dependent on all of these other things.
Yeah.
So
okay.
I think that's the main worry. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's interesting. So so that brings in a number of issues to do with how God's intellect and will are going to relate to his power. So it seems to me that if there's an intelligibility to essence, okay, that God grants existence to, then we can know that intelligibility, despite the fact that there could be a counterfactual situation where God, can bring something about in a different way that he has brought it about, such as that you describe. So it could be the case that, God miraculously, keeps the cup suspended in midair or something like that. But we know, based on the intelligibility of the cup and the universe, that that's not what happens. And it doesn't seem to me that we need to avoid the counterfactual situation, or know that the counterfactual situation is not obtaining in order to know what the factual situation is. It seems to me that, that's a typical sort of, skeptical challenge, that unless you know the counterfactual scenario, you can't know what the factual scenario is. And it seems to me that we don't need to deploy that sort of reasoning when it comes to these issues, at least unless, some sort of justification for that kind of, skepticism comes about. So a number of things are. So one is that if God is making an intelligent use of his omnipotence and bringing things about, then what he brings about has an intelligibility to it, such that we can know it. And in knowing that intelligibility, we can know the various dependencies of things, even though counterfactually, God miraculously could do things in a different way. But my point there would be, and it's an epistemological one, that we don't need to exclude the counterfactual in order to know the factual.
Yeah, that's really good. Let me can I read something? This is
of course, anything goes. Anything goes on this podcast.
Okay, arguably too technical for a conversation, but since we're at our computers, so this is what I'm about to read is from the first chapter of De Primo, and Scotus is characterizing essential dependence. And he brings up the fact that Aristotle talks about dependence or priority and posteriority by essence. And so he's wondering whether this is an adequate explanation of essential dependence, and he doesn't think it is. So he offers either a correction to Aristotle, or maybe more charitably, what Aristotle must mean. But either way, he's taking Aristotle, offering some sort of tweak to make Aristotle's essential dependence in tune with his own. Okay, so here's the.
Can you share your screen, Tom, and we could read it together?
I can probably do that. I'm not familiar with this screen sharing on this program, but let me.
Yeah, it should be an option for you, button down there that might let you do it. And while I just want to mention real quick as that's getting set up, gentle listeners, I do want to do live Q&A here, maybe at the last half hour or so. So please keep any questions coming in, and we'll tend to those when we can.
I think it's the present button should allow you to do it. So we were hoping for an MMA style fight between the Scotist and the Thomist here. I brought my nunchucks to the chat.
Oh, no.
just as a matter of point of clarification, because we do have a question here from Pascal wanting to know what is the difference between essential dependence and grounding dependence. So maybe before we go any deeper, we could talk a little bit more specifically to clarify what does Duns Scotus mean by essential dependence?
Well, that's what I want to talk about.
Okay, great.
That's what's coming up. Right.
Yeah.
But has it shared yet? It hasn't shared, has it?
No, it has not. If it doesn't work, no worries. Just read it aloud, and I'm sure we'll follow along good enough.
Hang on, let me try one quick thing. If it takes too long, I'll just give it up. But oh no, I have to change some security settings, it looks like.
Oh yeah, that's all right.
We'd have to quit the conversation.
We can all listen attentively if you just want to read it aloud.
All right.
Yeah, and bear in mind it is Scotist, so read it nice and slowly for us.
Yeah, this is relatively intelligible, I think.
Okay, great.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So this is in section 4 of De Primo Principio 1, and what he's doing here in the section is dividing essential order into two types of essential order. There's the essential order of eminence, being greater than or less than by nature or essence, and then the essential order of dependence, which is the kind that we're talking about. And then in the second part of that section, he gets to dependence after describing eminence. And here's what he says. In the essential order of dependence, the prior is called that on which something depends, and the posterior is that which depends. And Aristotle has this sense of priority in Metaphysics 5. And Aristotle characterizes essential dependence the following way. Okay. This is Aristotle. The prior, according to nature or essence, can exist without the posterior, but not conversely. Okay, so that's the key thing. It's you have essential dependence when the prior does not, you could have the existence of the prior without the existence of the posterior, but you couldn't have the existence of the posterior without the existence of the prior.
Right. So it's a part of the essence of, say, X, that it exists only if Y exists.
Well, yeah, that hasn't quite come into it yet, but that's how Scotus is reporting Aristotle.
Okay.
So
if I could just clarify, so is it a condition of X or the essence of X that only X exists because Y exists, or that only X exists because through another, but it doesn't stipulate Y or anything like that, so that we can know from the nature of X that there is a dependency there, but we can't, say that on which it's dependent, unless we kind of go further.
No, that's a very nice point, and this what you say maybe is a nicer way of characterizing what I was describing as my skepticism, because we can know that something is dependent in its essence, even if maybe we can't always know what is dependent on.
Exactly. And that's isn't that the human point, about causality, that, you could have a different cause for an effect. So there's nothing about knowing the effect that can tell us anything about the cause. And Hume uses that to drive a wedge between the connection of cause and effect.
So
there, I've just thrown Hume into the mix with Aquinas and Scotus.
So just to give an example to make it, I guess, a little bit more concrete. I mean, there are probably some things where we can see this sort of rigid essential grounding. This might be a somewhat controversial example, but take Socrates' singleton, right? That's only going to exist if Socrates exists, I would say, right? And so it's not just dependent, but like it needs to be Socrates too. It can't be Frank, right?
Yeah.
So are you saying in that case, Pat, you can know something about the essential dependence and the cause of that essential dependence?
And what its ground has to be. At least that's the first thing that sings in my mind of where that might be the case. I don't think I'd want to go much quicker beyond that to say that that's always going to be the case, but that seems to be a clear case where that almost certainly would definitely be the case, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe if I could sort of bring up, I mean, we can say, okay, you can say something very specific like that about Socrates' singleton, and because that is so specific, maybe you can say something about the cause of Socrates' singleton. But can you say something so general that we can also say something about the cause of the essential dependency? Can we say something like, X is lacking in actuality in some respect, so there must be some cause for that actuality, without stipulating what it is or anything like that? That seems to me just so metaphysically general that you can infer something about the cause, that the cause must have that actuality or be able to impart that actuality itself.
Yeah, that's how the proof works in chapter 3. He begins with this premise that something can come into existence, or something is producible. Where what he's talking about there is, there is the nature being producible. And then of course human nature is producible, horse nature is all kinds of natures are producible, but the only ratio that he's concerned with here is just being being producible. And just from that thing alone, any nature that is that, whatever else it has. And then he gets all the way to something that is able to produce, but itself is not producible, again, by nature. And at the end of that argument, all we know about it is that it has this note that it is productive.
That seems to me very similar to what Thomist does in many of his arguments. But he talks in terms of actuality. But again, it's metaphysically very minimal. They're very, very it's so metaphysically general that this sort of balk at the sort of moves or the intelligibility of it would be to sort of doubt the whole foundations of your metaphysics. Tom, sorry, go on.
No, I think that's right. So yeah, go on. I still haven't read what Scotus's account of essential dependence is. But
maybe you should do that, because I was about to get us into natures and modality and individuation just from something that you said there. So maybe you should finish reading what you want to read.
It's not too far afield actually from that. So here's the point. Scotus exposits Aristotle as holding that essential dependence means he explains it in terms of existence. where the posterior can't exist without the prior, but the prior can exist without the posterior. And I won't read the following. I'll just say what Scotus says. Here's the change that Scotus makes. He wants to say, let's not understand essential dependence in terms of existence or ability to exist with or without. Let's instead understand it in terms of what is contradictory. So he says to be essentially prior, to be essentially posterior to something prior is to be such that it is contradictory, that the posterior should exist and not the prior.
Yeah.
But there's no contradiction in supposing that the prior exists without the posterior. And he gives a case, probably because he has Avicenna in mind, where he wants to say something might produce an effect necessarily. And so you actually couldn't have that thing existing and not its effect existing.
Yeah,
but
that's a very Avicennian sort of notion.
Yeah, right. And but in such a case, we would still have essential dependence, right? Even though the thing that follows from the prior, must exist if the prior exists. But Scotus thinks that this contradictory language is what allows for that possibility that something produces its effect necessarily, and still has a nature such that it is prior by nature to the posterior. Now, in the end, he thinks that the first in the order of efficiency need not efficiently cause anything. So it's purely contingent whether anything else in fact exists. But he does build in this, call it a logical or quasi-logical way of characterizing essential dependence, whereas Aristotle characterized it in terms of existence. Now, this is fitting. This is to your thought about modality. I mean, this is crucial, and I don't think people have realized this before, but this is crucial to the way that Scotus's arguments later on in chapter 3 are supposed to work, where we are prescinding from the question of what things exist, and we're supposed to just be, considering natures and trying to understand logical or quasi-logical relations that hold between natures. So if you have a nature that is producible, then it follows that there's nature that is productive. So let me pause there. So that's Scotus on essential dependence. So so when we get to essentially ordered causal series, we still have these, these three criteria that you mentioned, but that's all within the context of this broader account of essential order as such.
Yeah, very good. Can I swing to natures and individuation?
Yeah, well, can I pose one more thing to maybe help show the significance of this discussion real quick? Specifically back to what you said before, Gavin, concerning simultaneity. I think one of the reasons people are interested in that notion, I don't want to speak for Phaser because he's not here, but it does strike me that he's interested in this as well, is to establish God not just as a cause in universe some time ago, but a sustaining cause, right? A sustaining cause. So let me read an objection to that. This is actually quoted in that paper of mine I mentioned before from Jordan Howard Sobel, who's going after the sustaining cause idea. And I'd like both of you to respond to it in relation to everything that was just said, just so people can maybe see why this debate matters and if we need simultaneity to sensibly respond to it. So Sobel says this. He says, "Do I have a sustaining efficient cause? Is there anything that is no part of me without which that thing I could not now exist and act? I doubt it, and I am not bragging. I doubt that there is anything separate from you, the present existence of which is necessary for your present existence, or that there is anything separate from any sensible thing that is necessary for its existence." And then later in context, Sobel goes on to reference Bill Rowe, and they give various examples of, hey, yeah, maybe you depend on oxygen, but even if you got rid of oxygen, you wouldn't be immediately expunged from existence or something like that. Yeah. So is that clear enough for you guys to maybe take some responses to it? Yeah.
Tom, I'm happy if you want to go first on that, or I mean, I've got a few things I'd like to say, but if you want to go first, I don't mind.
I don't have much actually. So, but let me just say that I mean, this just whatever we want to say about essential dependence just seems implausible to think that by intuition we could. I certainly don't have an intuition myself that there is nothing that I presently depend on for my present existence. I mean, if I were like immediately transported into the center of the sun, would there be an amount of time before my death? Like to be there, I suppose, would be to be dead. So I don't know. I mean, that's not a very metaphysical reply. That's just I've always thought that the arguments for conservation are helped by what I've always taken to be a very intuitive thought that we depend right now on stuff besides ourselves.
Yeah, and I would suggest that if you think that there's really something going for the notion of grounding just is deep ontological dependence. That's all it is. But that also seems to be tied up with simultaneity.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where I'm kind of pushing, wondering, okay, is simultaneity something that we need to avoid this type of objection? And if so, maybe that's not so bad, because I think there's a lot that can be said for grounding and deep ontological dependence, simultaneity.
Yeah.
But Gavin, your thoughts now?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So I think, I mean, this is really just the whole issue of inertia, isn't it? That could things have a kind of inertia by which they continue in existence? And so, I mean, Pat, you and I have spoken a lot on this, and I've published on it a bit. It seems to me that, first of all, that whenever these thought experiments are constructed, they're thinking of coming in and going out of existence as some sort of process, like generation and corruption, which is not what's happening metaphysically when something comes in and out of existence. It's an all or nothing affair when something goes in or out of existence. So I could see somebody, just to your point, Tom, if you were to be exported to the center of the sun, I could still see somebody pushing back saying, well, there will be a process by which you cease to exist, however short. Thankfully, they would still be saying there is a process because there's work that has to be done for you to cease to exist. But metaphysically speaking, what's happening is that if I'm dependent for my existence, remove the cause of that and you remove me, because I've got nothing anymore on which to depend. Now, this raises the issue of simultaneity, because it's not that we're dependent on the cause of existence in the act of causation, pace Scotus. It's we're dependent on the cause of existence for the causality. So I participate in my act of existence, which participates in God. So we're a step removed then, which I think helps us, sort of allows us to say that while simultaneity can coincide with such causality, it's not essential to the causality.
So just walk me through then. I mean, from that, I worry. Well, that sounds like Aquinas wouldn't need conservation, but of course he does. So what am I missing here? Because it does seem like there is simultaneity between God's causality of both my causality and my ability to cause.
I would say at most that there's simultaneity between the causality and the cause. So that the causality that God brings about in me, I'd say there's simultaneity between that, because that's his granting of existence.
Yeah.
But I, who participate in that causality, there wouldn't be simultaneity between me and the cause of that causality. So God can conserve the causality, right, without me being simultaneous with God as the cause.
In the you'll know where, but is it the there's this line that I remember, but I can't remember where. Creation is both in the creature and is the creature. The act of creation, taken passively, is it both is the creature and is in the creature. When you're talking about God's causality as something separable in some way from yourself. I mean, at least conceptually. Are you thinking there of like the act of creation? Is that what causality means there?
So, so what you're referring to there, I think, is in the De Potentia Dei, where he talks about the act of creation as the creature's dependence on God with respect to its act of existence. So the act of creation really is the actuality of existence in the creature, which thereby signifies the relation that the creature has to God. I think that might be what's being referred to. So your second question then was it? Could you repeat the second question? Sorry.
Well, I'm trying to get a handle on what, just trying to understand better this distinction between the causality that participates in God's causality and me, who somehow has the causality, that causality or exercises it.
Yeah. So think of the hand, stick, stone example. The causality is something that the cause imparts to the thing which has the causality. So the hand, the stick, and the stone, they have the causality of motion, and the motion is imparted to them by the agent, the source of motion. So in the case of creatures, then, the causality the creatures have is their active existence, which is imparted to them by God, the primary cause of that active existence.
Yeah. Because at a certain level of generality, all efficient causing is some sort of existence impartation.
Yeah.
Okay. So we can describe my causality as my act of existence, but then if I'm causing this or that, I'm imparting something to something else or to some subject, and that's, I mean, what's an appropriate way to describe this Thomistically? That I'm, here's all of my causality. It's like all of me, and then in some particular instance of causing something, there's this slice of me that I'm enacting. I mean, is that too florid a way to put it? I mean,
well, I mean, you're certainly, bringing about some sort of new actuality when you cause something, and all the qualifications about secondary causality. It's really cooperating with God's primary causality. So, when you bring something about, there is an actuality that you give to something which you could not give were you not in possession in some way of that actuality yourself.
Yeah. So I wonder if it helps understand the differences here. I don't recall anywhere in Scotus, certainly not in the De Primo, anything like a description of my existence as a whole as a causality or my causality.
Well, go on. Sorry.
Yeah. That when he's talking about the simultaneous things that are simultaneous in their causing, in causando, he's referring to at the moment that some agent is producing its effect, so it's causing its effect. It is essentially dependent on something prior to it that is causing its causing of that effect, and then causing the causing of the effect. So that's where the causality language finds its home in Scotus. So it's the causality not of the existence of thing as a whole, but it's the causality of this particular effect, the existence of this particular effect, which the agent couldn't do. It couldn't cause that effect if its causing of that effect weren't being caused by.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, it's a view of causality that I don't think I would find appealing, because I would want to appeal to something like causal powers, that a thing has causal powers and it can make use of those powers to act as a cause. And when I talk about causality, that's what I mean. These kind of causal powers that a thing has.
No, that's good. That's good. And Scotus wants there to be causal powers too. And so so one potential critique here is, if you've already given something causal power, why not just let it fly? Like, why do you have to be holding it as it's trying to flap its wings and get out of the nest?
Yeah. So I mean,
that's very nice.
The possession of causal power doesn't mean that the power itself doesn't have a cause and some sort of a primary agent. So a stock example is that the moon has the causal power to illuminate at night, but it only has that causal power because it derives that power from the sun, which is shining on it.
Yeah.
So it's a real causal power that the moon has, but it's secondary, dependent upon the sun.
Yeah. Though in that case you do have simultaneity, but again that would be incidental to the account of the dependence on your view. Is that right?
Yeah. Well, in that case, it's the moon's kind of the light that the moon projects on the Earth. It's projected from the moon, and so it's a moon sort of sunlight as opposed to a Jupiter sunlight, or what do we say, a Venus light, which is being projected. So I think still with that, you can distinguish the causal powers from the primary source in which they get their causal powers, and that's enough to sort of drive a wedge with the simultaneity. So as I say, there's simultaneity between the primary cause and the causality, or the causal power. But the thing which sort of, has the causal power, I don't think there needs to be simultaneity with the primary cause.
Yeah, good. Whereas Scotus is going to characterize the causal power as, at least in part, in terms of the power to be I mean, he really believes in causal power. So I want to characterize this in a way that does justice and doesn't sound deflationary or occasion. The worry here is that there a sort of occasionalist.
Yeah, that's what I was worrying about. Yeah,
and I mean, he really wants not to go there. But the thought would be that there are some causal powers, namely every creaturely causal power, that is still, by nature directed toward its effect, or toward a kind of effect that it has. Creatures have those causal powers, whether or not they are exercising them. At the moment of some exercise of a causal power, if there is an essential, well, there's always an essential causal order for anything that happens, but so there would be some kind of dependence on something for the exercising of the power. But the connection really is by nature. I mean, it's not as though that on which I'm dependent is sort of forcing me to do something that's alien to my nature or something like that. No, it's only because I have that causal power that the prior is able to cause my causing of whatever it's ultimately causing. Yeah, and that seems, in the case of human willing, Scotus has, I think, a nice way to put this. He describes willing as a rational power and says that, like any creaturely power, it's the sort of thing that is ultimately dependent on God at the moment of its eliciting its own act. But unlike natural powers, it, so to speak, can receive all the causal input it needs to elicit an act, and still be indifferent with respect to two or more two opposed options. So there, I think it's a helpful way of thinking about how the causal power really is a causal power. I mean, it's dependent at the moment of its causing, but it's not being caused to do this or that. That's up to it, up to the agent that has that will. And that's what makes it free on Scotus's view. Now, any other kind of cause, a natural cause or natural power, now it's in one sense determined to do what it does given its causal input, but still what follows from its link in the causal chain is due to the power that it has, the causal power that it has, and that very chain, so to speak, would go different if that link in the chain didn't have that very power. And is that just not enough to avoid occasionalism?
Oh, I mean, I think that would be fine. That's more than enough to avoid occasionalism.
Yeah.
So obviously, Scotus isn't an occasionalist.
Right.
So, I mean, yes, he does have a very rich ontology to avoid the occasionalist outlook.
So I want to make sure that you guys are happy with not skipping ahead too quick and that you're satisfied with this part of the discussion. But since Dr. Ward does have a time limit, I do want to make sure that we get on to discussing other things that I know we want to discuss, like divine ideas and individuation and stuff like that. So let me just make that note and then kick it back to you guys. We're going to go with this. Yep.
Well, I mean, if we could talk about natures and modality and stuff, because it's an interesting division between Aquinas and Scotus, because for Thomas, individuals are world bound. Okay, so an individual is bound by his world, his spatial temporal history, because he's individuated by the dimensive quantity of his matter. Now, what dimensive quantities they're accidental, but the dimensive quantity which follows upon matter isn't accidental. So the particular quantities, they can change and come and go, but that there is some quantity by which an individual is individuated makes the individual world bound. But as I understand Scotus, and this not only takes on individuation, it also takes in the issue of achaia as well. Individuals are not world bound, precisely because what individuates or what constitutes the individual for Scotus is something that that transcends its spatial temporal history, because it's this achaia. So conceivably, an individual could exist in a different world with a different spatial temporal history, but be the same individual. Whereas for Aquinas, that's not the case. Does that set up the issue?
Yeah, that's I've never heard the difference put quite that way before, and it raises all kinds of sort of questions about whether that's an appropriate way to talk about either thinker so let me just sort of feel this out a little bit to see why
for people who aren't yet in the deep end of the pool, like a lot of people in this conversation are, maybe we could just simplify what the problem is as we go into it. So we like props around here. We've got this individual, right?
Furby?
And the question is, Furby. We all remember Furby, right? The question is, what makes this individual Furby, right? And this seems to be a point of disagreement of how to account for that between Thomas and Scotus. I really did like the point you brought up last time we talked, Dr. Ward, that the fact that Thomas even wrestled with this question shows that he was definitely not the nominalist some people take him to be.
That Scotus wrestled with the question?
No, that Thomas did. Because as you know, Gavin, there are some people out there who claim that Thomas is like some sort of hidden nominalist or something like that. And if that's the case...
Really? Who says that?
Bob Pasnow.
Yeah, Pasnow.
Oh, yeah, right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you read Jeff Brower's account of
Mhm.
universals and Aquinas, he gives a
yeah.
whole list of
Yeah.
references of people who try to argue that Aquinas was
Mm.
anomalous. But I thought, anyway, I just wanted to reiterate Dr. Ward's point, because I was like, yeah, that seems to just kind of do away with that quickly. Anyway, sorry, did I frame the problem right? And then I'll let you guys continue. Yeah.
Yeah, that's dead on.
That's absolutely right. So the Thomistic view of individuation, an individual substance is made individual by its dimensive quantity,
Mhm.
which Gavin takes to have this implication that I've never thought about before, which is that it makes an individual substance world bound and having a spatial temporal history, having, say, a place in the spatial temporal history of the world that it is in by its nature, by the, or at least by the conditions of its actual existence.
Yes.
not by its nature quite. Is that fair, Gavin?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So by its constitution,
Yeah.
it's got its spatial temporal history such
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
if it didn't have that, it would have been a different individual.
Would have been a different individual.
So Gavin,
that very
what
soul-
makes this Furby for the Thomist then? Assuming
Well,
put the fact he's not an artifact, he's a substance. All
I was
right?
about to say, yeah.
So
the
denying
Furb-
it, right?
yeah.
He's got irreducible causal powers.
So the Furby has a substantial form which informs it's the prime matter, given dimensionality to the matter and given the particular conditions that the matter finds itself in. There's quantifiable sort of features there by which it can be located within space and time. And so it's this individual Furby and not that individual Furby, because no two things can occupy the same place and time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then in simple language, and then we can get into the weeds again. What would the Scotistic account be, Dr. Ward, for people who aren't familiar with hexaides and all that?
Yeah, that what individuates a substance is on, or anything really, is on the side of its. It's more on the side of form than it is on the side of matter, but that this individuating principle called thisness, sometimes hexeity or hekiety, is unlike other forms or formal principles insofar as it is non-shareable by nature. So we get Furby essence, which Furby shares with all the other Furbies. And then we get, does that one have a name?
This is Kirby the Furby.
Kirbiness. So Furby plus Kirbiness is the individual, the fully ramified individual essence of Kirby, such that, for Kirby to, well, yeah, that's it. So then we haven't made any reference to being material at all yet.
Mm-hmm.
And so what Gavin's getting at here is that if what is intelligible about Kirby, the Furby, is all on the side, so to speak, of form or essence, then we can locate Furby anywhere. We can take him out of this world and put him in a different possible world in which Furbies rule the galaxy and all of that. And that's nice. I mean, I myself, this will sound ironic as the more Scotist perspective, but I'm kind of allergic to possible worlds talk.
We agree.
Okay. Scotus is sometimes saddled with this, with being an innovator here and making possible worlds approach to modality make more sense than it otherwise would if Scotus hadn't come along. But for both Aquinas and Scotus, of course, what it would mean to be a possible world is to be something like a way that God could make things. So the thought of God being in a possible world, the way that God is in possible worlds on, say, a Plantinga development of Kripkean modality, is just like their heads, Aquinas's and Scotus's heads just explode. Like the thought of God being in a possible world. Or even if you say, oh no, but we mean that to be a good thing, because as maximally excellent, he's in all of them, and he's God in all of them. It's like, no, stop it. So I was taken aback, Gavin, when you set up the difference between Scotus and Aquinas in terms of possible worlds.
Well, so maybe if we could just sort of, tease this out a wee bit.
Yeah.
There seems to be this Avicennian background by which natures or essences, they've got this threefold mode of being. They exist in the thing, they exist in the mind, and they exist absolutely in themselves. Now, as I read Aquinas, and my reading of Aquinas is not uncontroversial, the absolute mode of being for the essence is being abstracted in the mind for Thomas, because that's the only place that the essence, exists absolutely in itself and not in forming matter. But it seems to me that if Scotus makes room for essence absolutely independent of both mind and the thing of which it is the essence, and independent of God, we have possible worlds, or some kind of possible world.
This is a long, hard issue in Scotus scholarship. It's hard to unpack. I'll just say that my view is that oh gosh, it's hard. Okay, so I mean the thought is that there is a dependence by nature of every creaturely nature on God. Now that doesn't quite save us, but or get us out of the concern that you're directing us to. But there's this other thing. There's this question in not only contemporary Scotist scholars, but early Scotists themselves, as they looked at Scotus's text, wondered, what exactly is God's relationship to the possible? Like, how does God ground, if at all, the possibility of what is possible? Some took Scotus himself to be committed to a view on which the whole realm, so to speak, of essences is constituted in its full intelligibility, completely independent of what God is or what God does. So we get statements in Scotus like the horse, equinity would be possible even if God had never existed. And that just sounds so bizarre. So then that makes it sound like possibility is first and foremost for Scotus just like a function of something like coherence or non-contradiction. And then we get all of the maximal conjunctions of possibilities sort of laid out simultaneously, synchronically, as the Scotists put it. And so then we get a way of, we can finally start picturing like what's happening actually in this world. Simultaneous with this happening is something else in another world that's happening, so to speak, right now. Not before, not afterward. In some sense, time doesn't apply if we're talking about two different worlds. But that's really the point, is that there isn't that possibility is no longer temporally indexed. So whether we describe that as synchronicity or simultaneity, that's the thought. That's how you can get possible worlds and sort of describe them in a model theoretic way. Okay. How does Scotus avoid that? I think it's roughly this, that the ratio of every possible nature, like every ratio of every possible nature, is has its exemplar in the divine mind as it reflects on its own divine nature. So we have, say, animality and rationality. Suppose these are simple concepts. You know, each answers to something in divinity. Now, we have the human nature, which is a certain kind of union of animality differentiated by rationality. Okay. Now, what explains, if anything, that particular conjunction or unity of these separate rationes? Is that something that God does? You know, think in himself animality, think in himself rationality, and then smush them together to get humanity? Well, no, says Scotus. Instead, all of the possible logical or quasi-logical relationships between simple rationes obtain, automatically. I mean, there's no explanation about why animality and rationality can form an essence. Likewise, there's no explanation about why being a square and being a sphere can't form an essence. So all of the stuff in Scotus about how intelligibility is sort of given independent of God's acting, that's where all that stuff comes from. But there's still a divine origin of the possible insofar as all of the content, so to speak, that is available to enter into these permutations is from God.
Well,
so that was too long. I'm sorry. This is hard and something I care a lot about in Scotus.
Well, good. This is good because I might want to sort of ask a follow-up question to that. If we have essence considered absolutely, so independent from in the mind and independent from in the thing, but that essence considered absolutely has some sort of, relation to an exemplar in the divine mind, what is the essence considered absolutely doing in our ontology? It seems like here we have a Meinongian sort of slum waiting to be topped up with, existence from God to produce creatures.
Yeah.
But if we've got the exemplars in the divine mind, what do we need these essences considered absolutely for?
Yeah. That's wonderful. It's a wonderful question. So, in your own approach to Aquinas's deenta argument, you take the nature absolutely considered. Well, actually, sorry, you didn't mention Aquinas. You were just reading Avicenna, but you take the nature absolutely considered, and you would put that in a mind, and then so we could say that when we consider the nature, as a universal, then what we're doing is we're sort of taking that very nature absolutely considered, and we're tacking on this additional feature, commonality or able to be shared by many or something like that. But then we can also have in our minds that very nature without that add-on. Is that correct so far?
So go on, and sounds all right. Yeah.
Okay.
It's not the way I discuss it, but yeah.
Oh, okay. So when you said earlier that you want to put nature absolutely considered in the mind, and that's a controversial reading of Aquinas.
Mm-hmm.
I meant to be just saying. I was trying to say what you said, but so you that's not quite right.
Well, all I mean when I say that the essence absolutely considered has no being independent of a mind.
Independent of a mind, yeah.
Whether a divine mind or a human mind.
And that's right. I mean, I take it that's controversial because isn't there a line in Deenta about absolutely considered, the nature absolutely considered has no active existence?
Yeah. What do I take that? The main active existence is in the actus essendi.
Yeah.
So it's being considered independent of its actual existence in the thing.
Yeah. Good. So then the worry is that does Scotus say like his de primo arguments where he wants to start with premises about the possible, would they generate, like, in order to take the argument seriously, do you have to have a Meinongian slum?
Yeah.
Essences that are not ideas in the mind of God, that are independent of human minds or angelic minds, somehow available to be thought prior to any experience with the world.
Yeah.
Not, of course, in our actual, I mean, their intelligibility as such is prior to any created minds, thinking anything or doing anything. So yeah, is it a Meinongian slum? It's quite nice. I don't think it is, though. The solution might.
Real quick, if I can just hop in right there, Dr. Ward, do you think that you need to start out with a very wide modal landscape to run Scotus's argument, or could you just start with something more narrow, like, oh, this Furby is possible because it's actual, and then would that be enough to? I haven't studied that. That seems to me to be how James Ross runs Scotus's argument, for example.
I mean, it's in the order of what we know. We know it's possible because it's actual, but that's not how the argument's supposed to work. I mean, this argument seems seriously undercut if in the end we have to start with, if something is actual.
Oh yes, that's
something is possible. Therefore, something could cause it. So instead, we have to start with not Furby, but Furby nature. Like, Furby nature is producible. And that's the Meinongian slum worry, I think. That
and he wants to just start right there. He doesn't want to say it's
that's
producible because it's actual.
Yeah.
Right?
So then the Thomist can say, no, let's just start with, like, the thing is
Furby's right here.
Furby's right there. And whereas Scotus seems to give himself this extra something. Now, in the end, I think that the only ontology that Scotus needs is the divine mind. So we are, in some sense, unbeknownst to ourselves, we're exploring the contents of God's mind before we realize that we get to God at the end of that exploration. And that seems fine. So I think the bigger worry would be if our only epistemic access to the first premise, something is producible, is that, like, Furby's right here and didn't make himself, and so something has in fact been produced. Then it seems like the argument is just a little too elaborate with very little payoff. But I don't know. I mean, we like ontological arguments. Suppose you thought, for example, that nothing in fact has been produced. Lots of people think this. If you have a kind of reductive ontology, not lots of people, but there are some representatives in the history of philosophy who have prominence. That in fact, there's nothing fundamental that is captured at the level of generable and corruptible things, and so to speak fundamentally about reality, we're only pointing to things that in fact have not come into existence. Whereas Scotus's argument might, like, it's one thing to say that physics has told us that in the actual world, nothing comes into existence or passes out of existence. It's quite another thing to say that it's a necessary truth, in every possible world, it's such that nothing has come into existence or passed out of existence. And then, the physicist definitely can't be playing physics if he wants to deny that premise. Whereas, then the Scotist can say, okay, look, even I disagree with you, but even if you grant that we can't get a causal argument for God going from facts about the actual world, I have access to all the possible worlds. And if there's just one of those worlds in which something comes into existence, then it's true in your modal way of talking. It's true that possibly something exists, or that something can be produced. Sorry, to speak more accurately, it's true that something can be produced, and so then I got my argument. And then, of course, it would end up being false in this world, that God doesn't exist, because anyway, everything in this world would in fact have some sort of causal relationship to God. But you could see how that might sound far-fetched, but you could see how the argument has this strength, that a cosmological argument, to say the first or second ways, with which I have, which like I support, but the Scotus' argument gives us this like extra something, I think.
Well, if I could follow up on that, I mean, I do see the appeal of having an argument which gives you that extra something which could undercut a lot of contrary sort of positions. And that really is the appeal of a lot of ontological type arguments and modal type arguments. But I also think that with Thomas's arguments, I don't think they're cosmological arguments. I think they're metaphysical arguments. And I think that what Thomas is after is a metaphysical argument based on sort of a metaphysics of act and potency and, per se ordered series, which regardless, of, what's going to happen in physics or anywhere else, is still going to be robust. And since it depends on the metaphysics, then the disagreement doesn't come at the level of the argument. It comes at the level of whether or not you accept the sort of metaphysics which Thomas is going to defend. So the spirit is still the same, to have an argument there which is kind of, ironclad, bulletproof. I suppose the difference comes just where the philosophical wrestling match is going to occur. Is it going to occur at the level of buttressing the metaphysics, or is it going to occur at the level of the argument itself, saying, defending each of the modal premises in Scotus's argument?
Yeah, that's nice. That's nice. I'm not sure what to say.
Well, we have 10 minutes before you absolutely have to go, Dr. Ward. So, again, there's two things we could do here. You guys could discuss any last minute things that you've really been itching to chat with each other, or we could try and squeeze in maybe one or two questions from the audience that are relevant to you before you have to split. Gavin, I don't know if you can hang longer and do Q&A after, or if you got to split too, or not.
Yeah, I can stay. I had a pint of coffee before coming on. Okay. So, yeah, if I do stay, but I do think it would be important, just if we're going to deal with questions, not to deal with questions, offered to Tom or on Scotism in general.
Yeah, well, why don't, if unless there's anything else you guys really want to touch on out between the two of you, why don't I just pull up a question or two that seems to be specifically direct to Tom? That's cool. Is that all right?
Cool. With me.
All right.
Yep.
All right. So here's one from Kirby, who's sharing the same name with Furby here. And by the way, I didn't give him this name because of this Kirby. This is legitimately, his name was Kirby from my kids. This is my kid's Furby. Just want to clarify that.
Well, I'm reading the question right now. Oh gosh.
Yes. So the question is this. Let me read it aloud because there'll be listeners. Catherine Pickstock argues that in after writing that Scotus gave birth to nominalism, even before Occam did. Does Dr. Ward have any thoughts on this? Sorry if we just opened up a way too big of a can for before you have to go in just a few minutes, but you could give a gesture of what you think the right response is.
I think Tom looks triggered there from that.
Yeah, I have been triggered, but I've now regained my composure, and so I'll say why I disagree with this comment in a but giving it the most charitable read that I can. So I think the person who's made most sense out of this association of Scotus and nominalism is actually Charles Taylor. And it's this sort of general Franciscan emphasis on the individual, right? And so then you could associate ideas here. You have the nominalism has one kind of emphasis on the individual because it says there are only individuals, no common natures. Scotism, despite emphatically, explicitly, over many arguments, rejecting nominalism, has its own kind of emphasis on the individual in his doctrine of individuation by thisness. Okay, so now we have Scotus emphasizing thisness. We have Occam as the first major 14th century nominalist, and both are Franciscans. And Franciscans in general have this turn to the individual, perhaps through St. Francis's love of individuals, maybe even the individual baby Jesus. And so with all of this individuality going on in Franciscanness, lo and behold, Scotus is kind of like Occam, who was a nominalist, and therefore, in one way of an invalid mode of inference, we could say that Scotus was kind of like a nominalist. And there we go.
That must drive you insane, Tom, seeing that sort of reasoning.
Yeah, it does. What do you have a take on that, Gavin?
It just seems to me that Scotus is just kicking around a wee bit too early to be a nominalist, because the scholastic nominalism really, kicked off with the turn to the new logic that Occam develops. And that logic, whilst it might have had some precursors, it certainly didn't have the sort of wide readership and discipleship that it had when Occam comes along in order to make way for nominalism. So that makes it highly unlikely that Scotus would be a nominalist. But when you just read Scotus, you can see that he's not a nominalist. So, I mean, I think somebody who says that Scotus is the birth of nominalism, they haven't read Scotus.
Yeah.
Hey, before you have to split, Dr. Ward, please remind us about your very, very good book on Scotus. I want to make sure we get the relevant plugs in here for you. There it is. Gavin's holding up the copy. He came ready. Give the quick plug before you have to go. And of course, I'm going to encourage people to grab a copy of it.
Gosh, well, I'm really grateful for that, but I definitely don't deserve it. I thanks for having me on earlier, where we talked about the book, and Ordered by Love is what it's called. Gavin, I want to talk more about all this stuff, man. Whether it's Pat, I don't know what your production schedule is like, whether it's a show.
I'm all just waiting for part 2. I'm ready for it. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm sure the audience is as well. Yeah.
I'd like to, I feel like my brain was picked more than your brain was picked, Gavin. and Pat, we didn't get into your stuff with grounding very deeply at all. And so I'd like to maybe do this again.
I would love to. So what I will do is I'll just coordinate with both of you. I know you're in semester now and things are pretty busy, but I'm sure we can work out a time and we'll make it happen. I would absolutely love that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, good. I'm sorry I had to cut this early. To any listeners, this was not part of our original plan, but something came up and I had to cut out. And Pat and Gavin are being really gracious.
Oh no, please! You're gracious. You already gave us an hour and a half of awesome time, and we love it. So I just want to say, so Gavin, I'm good to hang out for a little bit more if you want to just spend some time on these other questions as well. But I want to encourage people again. First, if you like the conversation so far, please like it, comment, and let us know what you would like to see these two explore in the future conversation whenever we get that on the books. And check out Ordered by Love, Dr. Ward's really great book. I'll be sure to link it afterwards in the show notes and all that. And this has been great. I knew it would be great. And I knew that we just kind of keep going deeper and deeper and deeper, and which is good. Which is good. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Maybe if I could say before Tom goes, his book is definitely, worth buying. And one of the things I really appreciated about the book is pointing out how any differences between Scotus and Aquinas, they're not monumental, but they literally turn on extremely precise scholastic sort of points. But there's a lot of commonality between Thomas and Scotus, which is left unexplored. And I think it's sort of in our conversation that we've had together this evening, it's bearing out that fact that the difference between a Thomist and a Scotist is usually on a very precise issue that only, say, professional philosophers or theologians would fight over. But that in general, that there's a lot of commonality and similarity of philosophical concerns between the two. So, so it's been good And we should come back for part 2, especially to discuss individuation more and all of that good stuff.
Yeah, and I could figure out what my weapon of choice would be. If you're bringing nunchucks, I'll have to think about it.
I'll stick with Furby. I'll be gentle. Anything else you want to mention before you got to split, Dr. Ward? Any upcoming books or projects or anything else you want to just?
Well, we were reading from De Primo Principio a bit, and Gavin threw me for a loop by referencing very specific aspects of it right at the start of the conversation. I was in the deep end before I had even realized where I was. But I've translated that book, the De Primo Principio, and so that's coming out later this year. Really looking forward to sharing it with the world.
Yeah, great. Well, we look forward to sharing that as well and discussing on the podcast. So thank you again very much, Dr. Ward. We really appreciate it. This has been great. We will get a part 2 on the books. Anybody wants to hang around, Gavin and I will tackle a few questions until I'm called down to dinner, which won't be too long for now, but we got a little extra time. Awesome. And thank you so much, Tom. Really appreciate it. Yep.
Take care.
Thank you, Tom. God bless you.
Have a great one. All right, Gavin, you ready to continue?
Absolutely. Yeah, let's do it.
Do some questions here. All right, guys, if you have something specifically directed at Dr. Ward, we're not gonna take those questions, but anything that's just general or relevant or specific to Gavin. Gavin, if you can see the questions as well, so if anything is popping out at you in particular, feel free to point it out, grab it.
There's quite a few.
Yeah, good, a lot of good stuff today.
Do you see anything? Maybe the gentle listeners should.
Well, there's one on Gavin has taken the sword against existential inertia. How would a Scotist respond? Well, we'll have to ask Dr. Ward about that next time, I guess. Let's see here. Just going to scroll through here. Here's one. Okay, here's one on De Ente, Gavin. Cuban wants to know, does Aquinas skip a step in the argument towards ipsum esse subsistens? Could God be an active existence as opposed to being itself? In other words, a being whose essence is identical to its own existence, but not existence as such. So it sounds like, maybe there's just going to be multiple beings who are identical to existence. Right?
Okay, so I mean, this has come up recently as a sort of an understanding or an imputed understanding of what Aquinas thinks about existence and the act of existence. So to just get Aquinas' position right, there is no individual act of existence that a thing enjoys. Okay, so there is no individual act of existence that a thing enjoys. There is only an individuated act of existence, which individuation occurs after just the act of existence is composed with the thing's essence. So prior to the thing, there is just existence or esse. And then when the thing is brought into existence or existence is granted to it, individuation occurs. So it's not individual active existence, but individuated active existence. So that being the case, if there is just esse and not an individual esse, if we have something whose essence is identical to esse, then it is esse itself. It's not identical to an individual active esse. It is just identical to esse itself because there is no individual active existence. Acts of existence are individuated by the thing whose acts they are.
Yeah. Excellent. Very clear. Good response, Gavin. Thank you for clearing that up for us.
And I would just point out that at no point in the De Ente does Aquinas talk about an individual active existence. At no point. He doesn't even talk about an individuated active existence in the De Ente. It's elsewhere where he talks about the individuation of existence by deploying the principle of his participation metaphysics that unreceived act is unlimited.
Right. Yeah. Always good to read those primary texts, isn't it? Gulfside wanted us to talk about the univocal language disagreement. Again, Tom isn't here anymore, so I don't want to speak for him, but I will mention in his book, he thinks actually Thomas and Scotus are actually very friendly on this matter, and that a lot of the alleged disagreement is overblown. So you could speak to that maybe a little bit, Gavin.
I think absolutely. I think Tom did a very good job in showing how Aquinas and Scotus converge on this issue. And he came up with a brilliant term. I loved it in the book that what is it? The term univocal is not a univocal term. There's different ways that term can be taken. And what Scotus seems to be emphasizing is something that Thomas emphasizes as well in his doctrine of analogy, that analogy requires some sort of stability of meaning, but difference in application. So when we say God is good and creatures are good, we're the thing that we affirm of both, the thing signified, the res significata, is the same, but the mode in which it is signified is different, because God is per se good and creatures are, per aliud good. But goodness itself is applied to both. The thing signified is applied to both. And it seems on Tom's presentation of Scotus that the same thing is going on there, that you do have some stability across the board, but there's also fluidity and fluctuation. And that's what Thomas is saying as well, because Thomas himself says analogy is a mixture of univocity and equivocity. Mm-hmm. It's a mixture between the two, and Scotus seems to be saying the same thing according to Tom. So yeah, there might be a disagreement amongst later generation Thomists and Scotists on the issue, but when we go back to the primary sources, there doesn't seem to be that much of a difference.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Gavin. Here's a good basic question. What is causality, Gavin? How should we understand it?
So it's dependence for actuality. Mm-hmm. That's what it is.
So in one of your papers, you do a very nice job, or it might be in your book, I forget. I've read a lot of your work, believe it or not. Okay. You do a nice job of contrasting causality as understood in really kind of a very wider sense by traditional philosophers like Aquinas and modern notions of causality. I don't know if you want to maybe highlight some of that now. Might be helpful to people. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So causality for Thomas isn't event causality. Okay. It's not how two events are related to each other. It's a relationship between two substances, and we were talking about causal powers here on the show. And one substance, or one thing, one being, has certain causal powers, certain actualities, which it can impart to the other, and the other to which it imparts that actuality is the effect of the thing which imparts the actuality. And so that's what causation involves. And the causality then that occurs in that causal relationship is the actuality that the one imparts to the other. And I don't think really there's any more that to be said about that. It undercuts a lot of the sort of modern challenges, or not modern challenges, but modern accounts of causality, precisely because they're reacting. They're trying to accommodate Hume's so-called insights, and yet say that there is some normativity within causal processes that we can observe and predict and so on.
Awesome. Great, Gavin. Thanks. I'm going to just keep clicking these off because you're giving really great, concise responses, as always. Here's a fun one. Callum wants to know, outside of the 5 ways in De Ante, Gavin, are there any other arguments for God's existence that you think succeed? The Augustinian proof, the contingency, PSR argument, fine-tuning. Yeah, what do you think, Gavin? Or are there any, maybe if you don't think they rise to the level of demonstration, do you think maybe there's other ones that you think are interesting or suggestive or plausible or anything like that? Curious your
thoughts. Yes. And he's away now, Tom's away now, but I didn't do a deep dive into it, but I was always convinced of Scotus's proof from the De Primo. As I've grown up more, so I read Richard Cross's book, the 2005 book. So that was, how long ago was 2005? That was, 18 years ago?
Is it 2020? It's 2023. Oh my goodness, yeah.
I read that. So I started thinking about per se ordered series 18 years ago.
Wow.
There you are. Yeah. But yeah, so yeah, I think it was 2005. Yeah, the Richard Cross book. And I didn't do a deep dive into it, but I was always impressed by that. And so, yeah, I would say that I do think that succeeds. But I suppose as I've grown up more, I've had certain misgivings about modality and stuff like that. So I would want to say, yes, I think the Scotistic proof succeeds, but with a caveat that I haven't returned to it, haven't done all my other work on proofs for God's existence.
Well, let me ask you this then, because you raised certain concerns that Dr. Ward was addressing. Do you yourself have a patch or response to those types of concerns when it comes to Scotus's approach to God?
I think so. With the issue of the Meinongian slum, I think we need to deal with essences absolutely considered by placing them within the mind of God. Whether or not Scotus himself whether or not we can dispense with that aspect of Scotus's ontology and still preserve the proofs of God's existence. is up for grabs. I think, with the divine ideas, you can, start with, the premise of able to be, possible to be, and then run the argument from that. So I think that can work, so that when we refer to essence as absolutely considered and as able to be, we're exploring the mind of God, yet we don't know yet that it's God's mind that we're exploring.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's good, because you don't want to make it circular, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
That was, and I talked about that with Dr. Ward in our conversation. All right, let's again, Gavin, if you want to grab something here, there's a lot of good stuff in the comment section. I don't want to dominate it all, but I'm just going to keep throwing things at you here. Okay, here's one on theories of time. T-Vax says, I came across a dispute between Phaser and Bruce. Don't you hate to see it? Don't you hate to see it? On whether Aristotelians have to be presentists. What does Gavin think about this, and would it affect the argument for motion? So for people who are not familiar, I know Phaser is a presentist. He defends it, and Proust, I believe, leans quite strongly towards the B theory of time.
It seems to me that Aristotelians generally are presentists.
I think that's right.
Yeah, because time is the measurement of the before and after in a process of change, and the only moment then of time that exists is the present. Because that's the only, so the now is all that exists, and when we're measuring the before and after, we're undergoing the presence in that process of change. So it seems to me that Aristotelians just because of that ontology, that's generally the way they are. How will it affect the argument from motion? Well, the argument from motion, it depends whose argument from motion. Sorry. How will it affect Aristotle's argument from motion? I haven't thought about that. He has lots of different arguments for motion, and he defends them in different ways, mainly with physical arguments. It doesn't seem to me that time really, the consideration of time really enters into his defense of the argument from motion. For Aquinas, the argument from motion is a metaphysical argument, so time absolutely does not enter in to the argument from motion for Thomas. So you take the first way. The entire of the first way is built up of an analysis of act and potency. No reference to physics there at all, except the observation that motion occurs. But everything else is drawn from metaphysics. So the nature of time just isn't going to figure in the argument. So it's irrelevant to the argument.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember, because I think Phaser and Koons had an exchange in ACPQ, and I think Koons is pushing against presentism a bit, but I think it was in there where he still thought that even if you abandon presentism, at least certain formulations, and again, I forget which one would be unaffected. It's Koons didn't think that it's essential. I don't know if that's Phaser's position or not, though. Mount Athos and Aquinas Fellowship, good friend of the show. Always great to have you here, Mount Athos. Thank you for tuning in. Wants to know what Dr. Kerr thinks of the transcendental argument for God. And by that, he means as, quote, the precondition for experience.
Okay, so what does Dr. Kerr think of transcendental argumentation for God? The precondition for experience? I'm not sure what he's referring to there.
Clarify. If you're still on the stream, Mount Athos, please just clarify a little bit.
I suppose it would, I would say I understand a transcendental argument to be that given X, what are the conditions for the possibility of X? And so I take the de ante proof, and I take Thomas's metaphysical reasoning in general to be transcendental reasoning, that, given that we have such and such, what are the conditions for its possibility? What is that without which it would not be? And that's the procedure and method in the de ante. But it seems to me that Mount Athos has something very specific in mind there. I just don't know what he's referring to. So if he wants to clarify, in the messages,
yeah. There's different. I am not a specialist in transcendental arguments, and often you see these in kind of presuppositional circles, which again I'm not that familiar with. But if you want to clarify, Mount Athos, we'll prioritize your clarification here. All right, let's take just a few more here. Callum wants to know, I've been wanting to ask a Thomist for ages. Well, your day has come, my friend. If you accept Ross's argument for an immaterial intellect, is that relevant to the existence of God? That the soul needs to be specially created after all?
Well, there's two issues there. There's the the immateriality of the intellect, and there's the direct creation of the soul, or the infusion of the soul into the body at the moment of conception. So one can affirm the immateriality of the intellect, as say that Aristotle seems to do, but just that doesn't enter into consideration with regard to the existence of God. Certainly, the existence of an immaterial soul is, it is going to be relevant to the whole issue of God, but maybe not so much in allowing us to infer his existence. It's just really evidence that, the material world is not the only world that there is, or the material realm is not the only realm that there is immateriality. And so that could point to something further. So I think that you can accept the immateriality of the intellect, but be ambivalent with regard to the existence of God. And there's a lot of modern contemporary philosophers of mind who do affirm some kind of property dualism, and they don't affirm God's existence. They're atheists. There's even some substance dualists. David Chalmers seems to be going along that way. Maybe not full-blown substance dualism, but there's a very strong dualism there. I don't think he affirms God's existence. So, there's all sorts of moves that you can make with regard to the immateriality of the intellect, which don't really have any relevance for God's existence.
Yeah, cool. Very good. All right, Mount Athos clarifies, yes, it's an argument that says even reason itself needs justification, being God, before experience can know presup circles exactly Pat. So
not only presuppositional circles. There's a number of Catholic thinkers who hold that philosophy just is not sufficient in itself to ground a theology, that it needs to be bootstrapped by theology, or that reason needs to be enabled by grace in order to do the job that reason needs to do. So this kind of argumentation, it seems to come from people who are big fans of Saint Augustine, for some reason. But with regard to this, the idea that reason needs some sort of justification before experience can be known, it's basically a skepticism about the power of reason to reach certain fundamental truths about reality. So that if we do know these fundamental truths, then because reason isn't sufficient to discover that, there must be something which has enabled our reason to discover that stronger than our reason, and that's something divine. It's for various reasons, it's not a position I buy into, because if we can't affirm some basic truths in philosophy and the sciences without appeal to God's existence, then it seems to me that if we do believe in God, God has just, given us this faculty of reason, which is infantile. It can't do the job that he's given it to us to do. So yeah, it's just an odd position.
Yeah. I'm not going to speak too much about the presuppositional circles. I've been trying to get somebody on to discuss it, and maybe at some point in the future I will. So yeah, I don't want to, but Gavin, that's a good response. Right here, Cuban says, I love Michael Humer's substance dualism, but how an immaterial intellect inheres a material body is pretty odd without God. Let me just say, I actually just read Humer's, got his book, Understanding Knowledge. Very, very interesting. And a lot of, I was thinking about maybe doing a little review of that book. Much I like about it. I like all of it. I don't agree with all of it. That's the thing. You can like stuff even if you don't agree with it. But he's kind of interesting guy. He's an ethical intuitionist. He's a moral realist. I think he's agnostic. I don't think he's a strong atheist. I think he's agnostic. In fact, in that book, Understanding Knowledge, he thinks that at least the fine-tuning argument for God is like interesting, he says. But it's kind of interesting because he thinks that like one of my issues, if I can just tease it a little bit here, maybe Gavin, this will get your thought. He thinks that intuitions about, he's an ethical intuitionist, right? So he thinks that intuitions can be justifying in a sense about certain moral truths. But he doesn't want to allow that for religious truths or experience of God. And I don't think ultimately you can have it one way without the other, would be one of my critiques of the book. Or at least he doesn't want to, I don't know. I'll just let you take it from there.
So that if we can have certain intuitions, about one non-perceptual sort of truth, such as moral sorts of truths, then why can't we have intuitions with regard to, say, divinity?
Right.
So everybody grants intuition about perceptual experiences that you can intuit physical things in the world, and they present themselves to our intuition as us and so why can't we do the same for, say, ethical facts, right, or divine facts? And ethical intuitionists will say, well, look, we can do it for ethical facts.
But then you try to cut it off before divine facts. I don't think, because it's kind of arbitrary in the sense that anything that you would use against the divine facts, such as, well, there's religious disagreement or disagreement about nature God. Well, there's moral disagreement, right? This is exactly what people say against ethical intuitionism, right?
Yeah.
Or arguments from evolution. So it just seems like a little bit of arbitrariness there was my complaint.
Yeah. It seems that, ethical intuitions are trying to track the geography of, what a person who is fully attuned to human nature knows with regard to flourishing within that nature. And so that generates certain intuitions of, how one ought to live or not. When it comes to divine facts, it seems to me that we can't have any intuitions about divine facts unless we have an independently plausible proof of God's existence. And even more than that, when it comes to the ethical facts, we need to be in tune with our human nature so that we can intuit these facts about what it would take to flourish in that nature. So if the same has to be said about God, we need to be in tune with the divine nature. So we would need even more than just a proof of God's existence. We would need to have an actual relationship with God himself before we could have divine intuitions about divinity.
Oh, sure. Yeah, about his nature. I guess the thing I would be more interested in is about God's existence. So then my question for you, Gavin, would really kind of relate to Plantinga's account, which I know you're familiar with. So for people who aren't that familiar with, Plantinga has this account of properly basic beliefs, and these are non-influential beliefs that are just sort of occasioned in us, and he gives all sorts of examples, beliefs in other minds and memory experiences and so on and so forth, right? And he thinks that these are perfectly warranted so long as certain conditions are met, proper function and the right environment according to a good design plan by a good designer and so on. So Plantinga's account essentially is this, like, oh yeah, you have this belief about God, well, then you're definitely justified if God exists, right? It's an externalist account.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on all that? Do you think there's anything going for Plantinga's account? Do you think it's compatible with Thomism, or do you completely reject it?
I completely reject it.
Most Thomists do, for whatever reason. Yeah, expand on the point. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think if we have anything like a proper basic belief, it's our perceptual experiences. Perceptual experiences disclose facts to us, or they make available facts in the world to us through which we can engage intelligently with the world. So if there's anything properly basic, it's just a perceptual experience, and everything's built up from that. But Plantinga is talking about beliefs, whereas I'm talking about a perception there. And I do think perception is an act of sensory consciousness. So I do think it's a conscious activity. It's not independent of consciousness, so it's cognitional. But I don't think the perception itself is a belief, but it might contain.
It'll occasion a belief, at least for Plantinga, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Whereas Plantinga just wants to talk about beliefs which are properly basic, almost playing the cognitive role the perceptual experiences typically play in our beliefs about the empirical world. It seems to me then that those properly basic beliefs are even more fundamental than experience. I don't think you can have any beliefs that are more fundamental than the beliefs formed from perceptual experience.
Yeah. I think that's right. And I'm not going to speak for Plantinga because he's not here on that, and I don't even want to try to. My question then would be this for you. So what Plantinga is concerned about is, and you'll know this, so this is for the audience, is that how can we say that somebody is justified, warranted, rational, believing in God, even apart from arguments? Because he definitely wants to say that, right? Think of the little old lady praying her rosary, right? Do we want to say that if she hasn't like totally comprehended the Deante and responded to Howard Sobel, right, that she's not rational or warranted in this belief? Do you think that this is a pseudo issue? How would you go about talk about that, or would you just say no, she is until she studies Deante, she's not one, right?
So I think so Plantinga moves from talk of justification of beliefs to what we're warranted to believe in, and that gives him enough wiggle room to start talking about, the faithful old lady, being warranted to believe in God. Whereas if we talk about justification, we would probably say she doesn't have a justification to believe in God because she doesn't have, the Deante proof. So warrant seems to be a wider in extension than justification. So
it's like the special quality. Yeah, it's not equivalent with justification. That's right. Yeah.
So it allows a lot more in. What I would just say there is that justification is an analogical notion. It's one thing for a philosopher to have justification for belief in God. It's another thing for the little faithful old lady to have justification for belief in God. There can be any number of reasons why she is justified in believing in God. In the same way that, I'm justified in believing that my children are mine, and should a doctor do a DNA test, the doctor will be justified in believing that my children are mine. My justification isn't the same as the doctor's justification, but it's still true. It still justifies me in believing that my children are mine, even though I don't have a DNA test. And the justification that I have for believing my children are mine are not the justification that the doctor would have, but we're still converging on something which is true, that my children are mine. So my justification for believing in God is, let's say, the Deante proof. The old lady's justification for believing in God is probably, a lifelong relationship with God. And that's what she presents as the justification. That justifies her because she's not a philosopher. I'm a philosopher, so I need something more than that to justify my belief in God. But they're all pointing to the same truth, that there is a God to be believed in.
Yeah, that's good. I like that, Gavin. That's good. I knew you'd have something very interesting and wise to say there, and I was not disappointed. All right, I have to go eat chili now. But before we do that, I want to make sure we mention your book. I think I have it here. Yes, I do. At least one of your books, anyways. Aquinas' Way to God. There it is. For those who really want to take a deep dive in Deante, this is great. So tell us, Gavin, where's the best place to get this? And of course, I'm going to encourage everyone to get a copy. And anything else you want to mention, plug, all that good stuff.
Yeah, so you can, anywhere they sell books, you can get it to be published by Oxford. So Amazon, Oxford University Press website, secondhand book dealers, all of that, your local library. It's outrageously expensive, one of those academic titles. So if you can get your university library to get it, or your local library, do that. But anywhere that you can find books, it's available.
The new anthology, the collection of essays. We have to mention that as well.
Yeah. And so there's the collected articles book, which just came out, which is being my collected articles on the existence of God. I kind of just realized last year that it's been a decade of thinking and writing about God's existence. So my first Deante paper came out, I think, around 2012.
Wow.
So 10 years on that. And I thought, well, that'll be nice. So let's get the collected articles together. And I put a couple of new articles in it along with the other ones. And the way I've structured it, it reads like you could just read it from cover to cover, or you could pick an article individually and read it. So you can either read it as one long monograph or kind of just read each article individually. So that's with Editionis Scholasticae. Feeser publishes with them often.
Yeah, they did a really nice
job. So there's that. And then just coming up, so I'm prepping my ACPA presentation on survivalism. to submit to the proceedings volume. So hopefully that gets published.
Oh, great.
What else is happening? I'm going to I'll be in Oxford in a couple of weeks. So I'm speaking at Oxford to I'm speaking at Oxford to Blackfriars. Kind of on the list sort of stuff on the active existence, God and creation, but also the Oxford Metaphysical Society got in touch when they heard I was coming. They want to put something on, so they're going to put something on Monday the 6th of February when I'll be there. So I'll be speaking at the Oxford Metaphysical Club, and then that evening I'll be speaking at Blackfriars. In March, all being well, I'll be attending a conference in Rome I'll be speaking at a conference in Rome on analytical Thomism. So I'll be speaking on that. And so in the past, I've said that, analytic philosophy and Thomism can't meet. So I've decided this time to maybe speak positively about dialogue between analytical philosophy and Thomism. And so I'm going to be going over the McDowell stuff, the epistemology, transcendental arguments, post-Kantian epistemology, which is where I think good convergences can happen. Mm-hmm. Then in June, it's not been advertised and it's not totally finalized yet, but I should be in Barcelona for the Symposium Thomisticum, where I'll be presenting a paper on Aquinas' philosophy of nature. So I'm staying busy, and teaching as well.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Super busy, but super awesome, and made the time to be on the podcast, Gavin, which we always appreciate. And again, I'll do my best to coordinate with you and Tom and set up a part 2, whenever that is, a week from now, 6 months from now, a year from now. We'll find a time to make it work. In the meantime, thank you everybody for tuning in. What you can do to help support this show and make sure this cool stuff keeps happening is just share it. Please do me a favor. Our growth is all because of the subscribers. So comment afterwards. Commenting, just getting discussion going really helps the algorithm, which everyone talks about these days, right? Sharing, subscribing, ringing that little bell, and we will catch you guys on the next episode. Fare thee well.
Okay, thank you.